The mysterious tale of the wreck of the Monasco off the coast of Newfoundland involves suspicions of foul play, stolen riches, and a sinister plot, leaving many lingering questions to this day. Legendary deep-sea diver David Dobbin investigated, discovering shockingly grisly details suggesting that there was much more than a mere shipwreck at play in the wreck of the Monasco.
You're listening to Backyard History, the hidden stories that happened in your own backyard, the podcast version of the weekly history column running in newspapers across the Maritimes, with your host and author, Andrew McLean.
The news of the shipwreck in Newfoundland made the front page of the New York Times on July 17th, 1857. It read,
"The bark Monasco of Warren, Maine, traveling from Gothenburg, Sweden to New York, was totally lost near Burin, Newfoundland on 21st July, together with 50 Swedish steerage passengers. The captain and his wife, the crew, and 6 passengers were saved. The crew and 6 passengers were landed in St. Pierre."
It had taken nearly 2 months for the news of the shipwreck off Newfoundland to reach New York City. A month earlier, though, the news made it to Newfoundland's capital of St. John's. The earliest report of the disaster appeared in a newspaper called The Newfoundlander on August 10th, 1857, after an unnamed local resident in Burin sent their offices a letter informing them of the tragic news.
"I'm sorry to inform you of a most melancholy shipwreck which happened close to this harbour on the night of Tuesday last, July 21st, of the bark Monasco, belonging to Verna in the state of Maine, and Andrew F. Daly, master, from Sweden to New York with a cargo of iron and 60 passengers. The weather was as fine as possible, but somewhat foggy, when she ran against the cliffs 3 miles west of Burin. The captain, his wife, and the crew escaped in the boat, and the passengers left in the vessel perished. 50 of the dead bodies were taken up on the 2 following days and buried without an inquest or an investigation."
The purpose of the Burinists' letter to the big newspapers in Newfoundland's capital was to demand a formal investigation into what really happened aboard the ship. They claimed, based on the suspicious behavior of the survivors, and the captain and his wife in particular, that there was much more to the story. However, there was no official investigation into what happened in the wreck of the Monasco. 35 years later, a notable Newfoundlander known as
Dobbin the Diver
caused a sensation when he told a reporter his story of what he saw when he had made a deep-sea dive down to the site of that shipwreck. Dobbin the Diver was interviewed in 1892, and the reporter for the Newfoundland Colonist newspaper opened his article by noting that most Newfoundlanders thought that Dobbin the Diver was dead. The reporter wrote,
"But he is alive, and though he's past 70, he is still hale and hearty. Lives with his son, John Dobbin, at 57 Colonial Street, where this reporter found him yesterday afternoon. Mr. Dobbin is in full possession of his faculties, and his eyes are as clear and his voice is as strong as it was 40 years ago."
Dobbin the Diver was by then 71 years old, at a time when the average life expectancy was only between 50 and 55 years old. During his wide-ranging interview with Dobbin the Diver, the reporter told the readers that the old diver recounted to him that he went to the site of the shipwreck of the Monasco soon after it had sunk.
Mr. Dobbin went to a place called Corbin's Head, situated between Burin and St. Lawrence on the western shore. The object of going there was to go down to the wreck of the Monasco, a vessel which had been lost the fall before.
The reporter refreshed the readers' memories on the mysterious circumstances of the shipwreck, writing,
"At the time she was lost, the captain, crew, and one woman, said by the captain to be his wife, landed at Burin in one of the ship's boats and told their tale of the shipwreck. The captain reported to have on board 76 passengers, mostly Swedish. These all went down with the vessel. No one escaped, but those who came to shore in the lifeboat. This story was accepted, and, in due course, the party got passage for England.
At the time of its sinking, the Monasco was practically a brand new ship, having been built only 2 years earlier in Maine. Its captain was 35-year-old Andrew F. Daly. The ship had been traveling from Gothenburg, Sweden, carrying about 60 people to New York City, although that was not their final destination. The 1850s, when the Monasco was wrecked, were a time of great immigration out of Sweden to the United States and Canada. For the most part, people were leaving their homes with their whole extended families in search of religious, personal, and economic freedom. Before departing, the immigrants would usually sell off everything they owned, bringing their life savings with them to this new land as they sailed into an unknown future. The passengers aboard the Monasco were ultimately heading to Minnesota, where a previous wave of immigrants from Gothenburg had already established a Swedish community, boasting farms, shops, and Swedish-language newspapers. The sinking of the Monasco triggered an outpouring of grief and rage in those Swedish newspapers in Minnesota. The sinking also had a deep impact on local people in Newfoundland in its immediate aftermath. The people of Burin would not let the story be forgotten because they suspected that there had been foul play in the sinking of the Monasco. In the wake of the shipwreck, Captain Andrew Daly and a woman claiming to be his wife, along with 5 other survivors, all of whom were members of the crew, had arrived in Burin, whose population at the time was 2,020 people, according to the 1857 census. Almost immediately, the survivors all took off for nearby St. Pierre Island, which is a part of France, and is out of the jurisdiction of Newfoundland authorities. Captain Daly seems to have left so quickly, he didn't actually report the wreck of his ship to Newfoundland's authorities. And the people of Burin thought this behavior was extremely suspicious. Shortly after the captain left, the Burinists wrote a second letter to the Public Ledger newspaper in St. John's, noting the captain's unusual behavior while he was in their town.
A package was picked up by some people of Burin, which was recognized by the captain as his, and upon naming the contents, the package was opened, and a sum of 1,100 pounds in dollars was handed over to him as his property. The contents tallying exactly with his statement. How will this agree with the reported great financial loss of the captain and the straits to which he was reduced?
In his interview 3 decades later, Dobbin the Diver echoed the townspeople's suspicions, telling the reporter,
Somehow, a rumor got abroad that all was not right, but it was not until after the captain and crew left the country that rumor gave way to a well-grounded suspicion that there had been foul play. Matters were in this position when Mr. Dobbin went down to the wreck of the Monasco.
As his nickname implies, David Dobbin was indeed a deep-sea diver. He wore specially designed suits made out of heavy canvas or rubber, often bright yellow or copper in color, which boasted a large metal helmet, which had a round, bulbous shape with a glass faceplate. The helmet was connected to the suit through a series of bolts and a collar to ensure it was watertight. He donned these heavy metal-weighted boots to walk along the bottom of the sea, and he was connected to a ship waiting above with a tube feeding him air. These suits were a marvel of the Victorian era, enabling divers to explore the depths of the sea for various purposes, ranging from salvage operations to underwater construction. However, they were also heavy and cumbersome, making the divers' work physically demanding and often dangerous. and they really captivated the public's imagination. The reporter was well aware of Dobbin the Diver's legendary status, and he was still in awe of him, writing,
30 years ago, there was not a name in all Newfoundland such a household word as Dobbin the Diver, and you will scarcely find a man, woman, or child in the country today who has not heard of Dobbin the Diver. Think of the man, who without any previous experience or guide, who, donning a diving suit, dropped down into the cold and unknown depths of the sea.
Before becoming a diver, David Dobbin had been a fisherman who, from a young age, enjoyed a particular reputation for daring and bravery. He had managed the remarkable feat of becoming a master of his own fishing boat by the age of only 18. Dobbin first ended up diving in the late autumn of 1849, when he was approached by a salvage ship operator named Smith McKay to go to Holyrood Beach, where they were searching the wreck of a schooner from PEI that had run ashore.
From his earliest years he was a fisherman, but being daring and brave, he was the master of his own boat when he was only 18 years old. In the fall of 1849, he had his first experience as a diver. He was fishing in St. Mary's when the late Smith McKay came there looking for men to assist in getting off a Prince Edward Island schooner that had run ashore on Holyrood Beach. During the work, Dobbin seemed to be so much at home in the water, and Mr. McKay asked him if a diving suit were procured, would he wear it? Dobbin answered, yes, and accordingly, the suit came out. I felt a little strange when I put on the diving dress at first, said Mr. Dobbin, but I was not scared, in fact. I was never scared in me life, he told me. The diver worked on this vessel until everything of value was removed from her.
Unperturbed by the tough manual work, wearing a cumbersome and heavy suit, working beneath the waves of the cold and dark seas, Dobbin continued to work that wreck until everything of value was removed, because they were salvage divers who were looking for anything of value aboard wrecked ships. Dobbin the Diver went on to become quite renowned in Newfoundland for his part in salvaging several shipwrecks, and his 1892 interview formed actually part of a multi-part series examining his eventful life. Despite this vast wealth of experience that he had under his diving bell, by the time he made it to the Monasco, even Dobbin the Diver was shocked by what he found in that shipwreck.
He had anticipated much, but the actual state of affairs on board the sunken vessel was awful in the extreme. First thing that met his gaze on going down was the body of a woman floating in and out over the ship's sides, swinging back and forth in the undertow. She appeared to be the body of a young woman, 22 or 23 years old. She was dressed in a blue jacket and red skirt, had a pair of cloth boots on. For one brief moment, the heart of the brave diver almost stood still.
Dobbin was baffled at how it was possible that the body could still be near the wreck instead of drifting away. He drew closer to examine the remains of the young woman more closely, and
he found the body had been lashed to the file rail of the main mast by a rope.
As he moved along the deck of the ship beneath the waves, he discovered another 4 bodies tied to the ship's railing. Dobbin began to suspect something far darker than a mere shipwreck had happened aboard the Monasco. He turned his attention towards the ship's enclosed cabin and discovered that the door had been nailed shut from the outside. He pried open the door, and inside,
the sight which there met his gaze was one to appall the stoutest heart and make man shrink from going further. There below him were the corpses of 71 women and men. Some were huddled in corners, some were face downward on the floor, and others, half propped up by a shelf or abutment, glared fiercely from their frozen dead eyes on the prying mortal who had dared to come amongst them. Others lay with a shriek of despair frozen on their lips. Others had fallen asleep peacefully, with the love light in their eyes. Here and there, A piece of richly covered furniture or picture frame floated amongst the human debris, while the sad sea waves sound the low and monotonous dirge of the 70 souls that had so suddenly been hurried to meet their God.
Dobbin told the reporter that
all these people had been barred down in the cabin by the captain and crew, left to perish.
it was an extreme accusation to make. Yet it echoed what the townspeople of Burin, who had personally encountered the Monasco's captain after he rowed ashore after the ship's sinking, had been trying to make public and have formally investigated in the wake of the shipwreck. The townspeople had earlier written a letter to the Public Ledger newspaper on August 7th, 1857, declaring,
"If the passengers had had their liberty, there could have been no loss of life, as the night was fine and calm as possible. At 5 of the passengers got out of the cabin before the captain got to the deck, when he gave orders to close the door and get out the boat, which being obeyed, himself, wife, and crew got into her and left the remainder of passengers, 55 in all, to their fate."
Aware of the severity in their accusation against the captain and the surviving crew, the people of Burin called for an inquest in which he would testify and rebut what they said, adding,
"Now this is a startling statement, but we trust his statement will be seen by him, and that he will come forward manfully and contradict it if untrue."
While Captain Daly never did respond directly to these accusations, nor was an inquest ever actually held, an account of his version of what happened actually does exist. After quickly departing Burin for St. Pierre, Captain Daly then caught a ship to Cape Breton to await another ship going back to America. While in his hotel, the captain recounted his versions of events to another guest there named Mr. Fuller, who promptly wrote them up and sent them to the Sydney Morning Post, explaining what Captain Daly had told him had actually happened aboard the ship.
They state that when the vessel struck against the cliff, they all thought it was an iceberg, and seeing no prospect for saving anything, the first thing thought of was preserving all the lives on board. The passengers were in the poop deck cabin, which they could not be induced to leave, although they were earnestly urged to do so. They, having closed the cabin doors in the hope of keeping the water out, and then betook themselves to prayer, with the exception of the 6 who left the cabin and were saved by the crew. Captain Daly was the last to leave the ship of those who were saved, but he and Mrs. Daly lost everything they had on board, including their clothing. His whole loss is estimated to be between $4,000 and $5,000.
However, the Public Ledger newspaper back in Newfoundland instantly disputed this account of the captain's financial losses, writing,
"It is reported that the vessel was insured and was partly owned by the captain."
The details of the shipwreck became murky and muddled with the passing of time. The name of the ship itself became a particular object of confusion over the coming years and decades and centuries as things were misremembered and written down wrong, and spelling and pronunciation changed over time. It actually took an extended amount of research on this one because the ship named the Monasco ended up, over the course of time, variously being misremembered as the Monasco, or the Kumaraski, or the Komaraski, or the Kamerski. The number of passengers, crews, and the number of deaths also tended to differ over time somewhat, with various sources, although they consistently ranged between 50 and 70. Interestingly, William Ryan wrote in a 1912 issue of Newfoundland Quarterly that his father Thomas, who'd been present at the docks of Burin when the Monasco's lifeboat rode in, recalled things somewhat differently, saying that there were 7 crew members who survived, but with them were possibly as many as 20 Swedes who'd also made it to shore, and he wrote that
"Many of the passengers wore fine jewelry."
There's not really anything unusual about things being misremembered or changed over time. Names in particular of places and events seem to change over time. For example, the location of the shipwreck has changed several times since the disaster. Today it's called Swallow Cove, but before that, its name was Silver's Cove. Before that, though, it was named Swedes Cove, because that was where the Swedish victims of the sinking of the Monasco were buried. How much we can read into whether the deaths of the Swedish immigrants on the Monasco were an accident or intentional may hinge on another name that changed. After Captain Andrew F. Daly returned home to Maine, American census records indicate that he married a new wife named Emily Hannah Daly. The identity of the only woman who accompanied the survivors of the wreck of the Monasco to Burin is somewhat mysterious. While Captain Daly claimed the unidentified woman who survived the Monasco was his wife, the Burinists claimed that this woman was actually Swedish. William Ryan wrote that his father never believed that Emily was actually the captain's real wife, consistently referring to her as
his supposed wife.
Ryan's father, Thomas, could speak French, and the Monasco's steward was from France. Thomas claimed to have gotten the story from the steward before the captain noticed them talking and ordered the steward away, which is a possible origin of the version of events that Newfoundlanders came to believe had actually happened aboard the Monasco. This is the version of that story, told to the reporter by Dobbin the Diver.
The passengers were members of a rich colonization company going to find a home in the scarcely populated western states. They chartered the vessel to take them out. On the voyage, they gave their money and jewels to the captain for safekeeping. Amongst the passengers was one very wealthy man, who was married to a young and pretty wife who'd been forced to marry him against her will. On the voyage, the captain got an inkling of how matters stood, and by the devilish wiles which bad-hearted, handsome men knew so well to employ, induced the young wife to fly with him if he would get rid of her husband. The captain unfolded the plot by degrees to the crew, who, of course, were well paid for their silence. Then, in the dead of night, those in the secret stole to the deck. The cabin door was nailed down, and the ship driven against the rocks.
According to this diver, who went down to the shipwreck, the captain of the Monasco locked the passengers under the ship, stole the Swedish immigrants' money and jewelry, stole one of their wives, and fled as the ship was sinking. And according to a poem written by William Ryan,
the Swedish victims on their pillows were entombed beneath the sea, buried in the troubled billows where the bark Monasco lay.
That was Backyard History with your host, Andrew McLean. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for another hidden story that happened in your own backyard. Produced by Jordan Lozier.